Michael Carter couldn't believe his eyes when he saw her crossing Central Park with two identical children holding her hands. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had worked as a housekeeper in his Manhattan penthouse 3 years ago, the one who had vanished without explanation, without even asking for her last paycheck. But it wasn't memories of the past that made his blood run cold. It was those two children, twins, who had exactly the same green eyes as his father. The same dimple on their chins that he saw every morning in the mirror. They looked about 2.5 years old, exactly the time that had passed since that night when he and Sarah had crossed a line they should never have crossed. Michael froze on the sidewalk, his heart pounding, as Sarah finally noticed him. Their eyes met across the crowd of tourists, and in those brown eyes he saw confirmation, terror, and something else. A secret that was about to explode and change everyone's lives forever, because those children were his. And Sarah had lived 3 years in the shadows, raising them alone, for reasons that Michael was about to discover were far more complicated and painful than he could ever have imagined. New York City sparkled under the May sunshine when Michael Carter stepped out of his office on Fifth Avenue for a lunch break. At 36, he was the CEO of Carter Investments, the family company that managed billions in assets. Tall, dark hair, impeccably groomed, custom-tailored suit from Savile Row, Michael embodied modern American success. But that day, as he walked toward his favorite restaurant near Central Park, something caught his eye. A woman with a double stroller, 2 children walking beside her, holding hands. There was something familiar in the way she moved, in the angle of her profile. Then she turned to call one of the children who had wandered toward a fountain, and Michael stopped dead. Sarah Mitchell. No doubt about it. The same chestnut hair pulled back in a low ponytail, the same delicate features, the same brown eyes he'd seen for 2 years in his penthouse when she arrived every morning to clean, cook, take care of the house. But Sarah had disappeared 3 years ago. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. She'd left only a note on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry. I have to go. Don't look for me." No explanation, no number to reach her. Michael had tried to find her, more out of concern than anything else, but she seemed to have vanished into thin air. And now she was there, 50 yards away, with 2 children. Twins, obviously. Michael started walking closer, his heart racing. Then one of the children, a little boy in a blue shirt, turned toward him laughing, and Michael felt the world stop. The boy's eyes were green, exactly the same intense, rare green as his. The dimple on his chin was identical to his own. The features, though still childlike, bore an unsettling resemblance to photos of Michael as a child that his mother kept jealously. The other child, a little girl in a yellow dress, turned too. Same green eyes, same dimple. Like someone had made 2 perfect copies of Michael as a child. Sarah chose that moment to look up. Their eyes met across the crowd of tourists. For a second, Michael saw a series of emotions cross her face. Shock, fear, resignation. Then, as if she'd made a decision, she took the children by the hand and started walking away, quickly. Michael moved without thinking, running through the tourists. He couldn't let her go again, not when he'd just seen what he'd seen. He caught up with her just as Sarah was trying to load the children into the double stroller. Sarah froze, her back rigid. She didn't turn immediately. When she did, her eyes were wet but determined. She spoke in a low but firm voice, asking him to leave her alone. Michael looked at the children, then her, then the children again. He asked in a hoarse voice if they were his. The silence that followed was crushing. Sarah closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. Then, slowly, she nodded. Michael felt his legs give way. He leaned against a building wall, trying to breathe. He had 2 children, twins, 2.5 years old, and he'd never known. Questions exploded in his mind like fireworks. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she run? How had she lived all this time? But looking at Sarah, seeing the tension in her body, the fear in her eyes, he understood that there, in the middle of Central Park with hundreds of tourists around, wasn't the place for that conversation. He suggested talking somewhere quiet. Sarah hesitated, her gaze going from the children to him. Then she nodded with resignation. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. Michael called his driver, asking him to bring the car. Sarah seemed about to protest, but then gave in. They were both too tired to fight. 20 minutes later, they were in the private living room of Michael's penthouse in the Upper East Side. The twins, Luke and Sophie, he'd learned their names, were playing on the Persian rug with some toys Michael had urgently bought from a nearby store. Sarah sat stiffly on the sofa, hands clasped in her lap. Michael poured her a glass of water with shaking hands. Then he sat across from her and said simply that he wanted to know everything, from the beginning. Sarah looked at her children playing, then stared at her hands in her lap. She started speaking in a low voice, the words coming out slowly, as if she was extracting them from a deep well of pain. That night had been 3.5 years ago. Michael remembered. How could he forget? It had been his 33rd birthday. He'd thrown a big party at the penthouse, invited friends, colleagues, even politicians. Everyone was there to celebrate, drink expensive champagne, network. But at the end of the evening, when the last guests had left and the caterers had finished cleaning up, Michael found himself strangely melancholic. The success, the compliments, the pats on the back, it all suddenly seemed empty. He'd drunk too much, true, but it wasn't just the alcohol. He'd found Sarah in the kitchen, finishing cleaning the last glasses. He'd insisted she go home, that it was late, that he'd finish. But she'd smiled with that sweetness that characterized her, saying it would only take a few minutes. They'd started talking about everything and nothing. Michael had discovered things he didn't know, that Sarah dreamed of opening a small restaurant, that cooking was her passion, that she'd lost her mother young. She'd listened to Michael confess how lonely he felt, despite success, how heavy family pressure was, how much he desired something real in a world of appearances. They'd talked for hours, drinking wine, laughing, and then, without knowing exactly how, they'd found themselves close, too close. One kiss became another, and before they could stop, before reason could prevail, they'd crossed a line they should never have crossed. The next morning, Michael had woken with a sense of panic. Sarah was already up, had gotten dressed, seemed calm but distant. She'd said they needed to forget what happened, that it had been a mistake, that she was just the housekeeper, and he the employer. Their lives were too different. Michael had tried to talk about it, but Sarah had been immovable. She needed that job, couldn't afford complications, so they'd pretended nothing happened. For 3 weeks, they were politely distant, professional. Then Sarah disappeared. Now, sitting on that penthouse sofa, Sarah explained what happened after. She'd discovered she was pregnant 3 weeks after that night. At first, she'd thought about telling him, but then she'd seen photos in gossip magazines. Michael at dinner with Amanda Morrison, the heiress of Morrison fashion. Articles talking about a possible engagement, imminent marriage between two of America's richest families. Sarah had realized how different their worlds were. She was a housekeeper without a college education, raised in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. He was a millionaire, heir to a financial empire, and she wasn't just pregnant. She was carrying twins, she'd discovered at the first ultrasound. She'd imagined the scandal, the shame for the Carter family. She'd imagined Michael might think she wanted to trap him, that she was after money. She'd imagined being seen as an unscrupulous woman who'd taken advantage of a night of weakness. So she'd made the most painful decision of her life. She ran. She left New York, returned to her hometown in upstate New York, to an aunt. She'd worked until the last month of pregnancy. Then Luke and Sophie were born. Beautiful, healthy, perfect. For 2 years, she'd stayed away from New York, living modestly with her aunt's help, doing part-time cleaning jobs, raising the children with immense love, but also with the constant fear that one day Michael would see them and understand. Then her aunt had died suddenly 6 months ago, leaving her alone. Sarah had to return to New York, where there were more job opportunities. She'd found a small apartment in Queens, worked nights cleaning offices so she could be with the children during the day. It was hard, it was exhausting, but they'd survived. That day in Central Park, they'd gone to see a doctor for a routine checkup for Sophie, who'd had a fever. Never in a million years would Sarah have thought she'd run into Michael. As Sarah talked, Michael felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger at not being informed, pain at having missed the first 2.5 years of his children's lives, but also understanding. He knew what his family was like, how rigid they were about reputation, appearances. His mother would have had a heart attack if she'd known the housekeeper was pregnant with her son's child. And that story, with Amanda Morrison, a media fabrication. Their families hoped for a marriage that would unite two empires, but there'd never been anything between Michael and Amanda. They were friends, nothing more. But the papers didn't care about the truth. He looked at the twins playing unaware, his son, his daughter, flesh of his flesh. 2.5 years when they could have called him Daddy, and instead, they didn't even know he existed. He stood, approached them, knelt down. Luke looked at him curiously, then offered him a plastic dinosaur. Sophie laughed and pulled his hair with her little hands. And in that moment, Michael felt something break and reassemble in his chest. In the following days, Michael couldn't think about anything else. He canceled meetings, ignored calls from his mother. His mind was completely occupied with Sarah, Luke, and Sophie. He discreetly hired a private investigator to verify Sarah's story. The report confirmed everything: the apartment in Queens, the night job, the aunt upstate, the twins' birth. Sarah had told the truth. Michael started showing up more often at the park where Sarah took the children. He brought toys, ice cream, smiled when Luke ran toward him shouting, "The Dinosaur Man!" for the collection he'd given him. A week after the Central Park encounter, Michael invited Sarah to dinner at his penthouse. She accepted reluctantly, leaving the children with a neighbor. That evening, Michael had tried to cook, creating a pasta disaster that made them both laugh. They ordered pizza instead, sitting on the balcony overlooking the illuminated New York skyline. It was there that Michael made his proposal. He wanted to legally recognize the children, be part of their lives, help Sarah financially. But he didn't stop there. With a seriousness that took Sarah's breath away, he said he wanted to marry her. Not for love, they were too honest to pretend, but for the children, to give them family, stability, the Carter name. Sarah remained silent, then asked if he was joking.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Michael shook his head. He was serious. A discreet civil wedding, then present the children to the family. There would be scandal, but it would fade, and the children would have every advantage. Sarah burst into tears. She couldn't accept charity, couldn't be seen as a gold digger. She'd fought that judgment for 3 years. Michael knelt, taking her hands. It wasn't charity. They were his children. He had the right to take care of them. And she deserved respect, not judgment. He confessed something that had tormented him. That night 3 years ago hadn't been just alcohol. There had been a real connection. Sarah had been the only person who'd seen him as Michael, not as the Carter heir. They weren't talking about a fairy tale marriage, but they could build something real, based on mutual respect and love for their children. Sarah asked for time to think. Michael nodded. But 2 days later, everything changed. Sarah received an unexpected visit. Beatrice Carter, Michael's mother. Beatrice Carter wasn't a woman accustomed to being contradicted. She entered Sarah's modest apartment with the same bearing she'd use crossing a Fifth Avenue mansion. Her gaze assessed the environment in 3 seconds. Cheap furniture, scattered toys, walls needing paint. Sarah, who was preparing lunch for the twins, froze with the wooden spoon in hand. She immediately recognized the woman from photos she'd seen when working at the penthouse. Her heart sank. Beatrice wasted no time. She said she knew everything. She'd had the driver follow Michael, had seen the park meetings, had put the pieces together. The twins were undeniably Carters. Only a blind person wouldn't see the resemblance. But instead of the anger Sarah expected, Beatrice showed something different. She sat at the kitchen table, a gesture that seemed to cost her effort, and spoke with calculated coldness. She said she understood the situation. The children existed. They were Carter blood. But there was a right way and a wrong way to handle it. She pulled from her purse a check and legal documents. She offered Sarah $500,000 immediately, plus a $2 million trust fund for the children's education. In exchange, Sarah would sign an agreement, paternity recognition for Michael, but no marriage, no public scandal. Sarah could live comfortably. The children would have the Carter name and privileged education, but they'd remain discreet. Beatrice also talked about the future. She explained that Michael had responsibilities, a company to lead, a marriage to make with the right woman, meaning Amanda Morrison. The twins would be recognized, sure, but Sarah had to understand her place, mother of Michael's children, not his wife. Sarah listened in silence, anger rising with each word. When Beatrice finished, Sarah spoke with an icy calm that surprised them both. She said Beatrice's offer was exactly the kind of transaction she'd feared 3 years ago. Money in exchange for silence. A tip to buy her dignity. She explained that Luke and Sophie weren't merchandise to negotiate. They weren't a problem to solve with a check. They were children who deserved both parents, not scheduled visits and money stained with shame. Beatrice stiffened, eyes flashing. She started talking about family reputation, how Michael's selfish actions had created this mess. But Sarah interrupted her. She said the only selfish thing had been fear. Her fear of telling Michael, and now Beatrice's fear of scandal. Then she said something that left Beatrice speechless. She said Michael had already proposed marriage, and she was considering accepting. Not for money, she could refuse $500,000 and survive, but for her children, who deserved a present father, not a name on legal documents. Beatrice turned livid. She threatened to use every resource to prove Sarah was unfit as a mother, that she'd lose custody. But her voice betrayed desperation, not strength. Sarah stood, pointing to the door. She told Beatrice to leave her apartment, and added that if she really wanted to know her grandchildren, she could start by respecting their mother. After Beatrice left, Sarah collapsed on the chair, shaking. But there was also a strange sense of liberation. She'd faced the dragon and survived. That evening she called Michael. She told him about the visit. Michael exploded in anger at his mother, but Sarah stopped him. She said she understood Beatrice's fears, even if she didn't share them. But she'd made a decision. She accepted his proposal. They would marry. It wouldn't be easy. There would be battles with the family, society's judgments. But their children deserved parents who fought for them, not who hid. The wedding was held at City Hall a month later, with only 2 witnesses. No big party, no photos in the papers. Just Michael and Sarah in simple clothes, exchanging promises before the judge, while Luke and Sophie played at their feet. But if they hoped to keep everything discreet, they were wrong. A photo taken by a tourist ended up on Instagram, then on gossip blogs. Michael Carter secretly marries his former housekeeper. She has twins. The headlines were sensationalistic and cruel. The Carter family reacted with fury. Michael's father, William, called from Palm Beach, where he lived in semi-retirement, threatening to disinherit him. Beatrice stopped talking completely with her son. Cousins and aunts bombarded with outraged messages. But Michael held firm. He officially presented Sarah as his wife at a company event, defying the whispers. He introduced Luke and Sophie as his children to the board of Carter Investments, stating they'd inherit the company one day. Sarah faced everything with silent dignity. She ignored the judgmental looks from other executives' wives. She smiled politely when high society women treated her with condescension. She focused on the children and building a life with Michael. And strangely, amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. Michael and Sarah actually started getting to know each other, not as employer and housekeeper, not as separated parents, but as husband and wife. They discovered they laughed at the same things, that they both preferred quiet evenings at home to society parties, that Michael loved when Sarah cooked traditional upstate New York dishes, that Sarah was fiercely intelligent, read voraciously, had sharp opinions on politics and economics. Michael started bringing Sarah to company meetings, asking her opinions. He was surprised by her insight. Sarah suggested an investment in small sustainable agricultural businesses that became incredibly profitable. The twins flourished. Luke was curious, infinitely energetic, loved when Michael took him to the office. Sophie was sweet, but stubborn, had taken control of the whole family with her smile. Both called Michael Daddy now, and every time they did, he felt his heart melt. But the real test came during Christmas, 8 months after the wedding. Michael insisted the traditional family gather at the penthouse, including his parents. Beatrice arrived reluctantly, her face a mask of disapproval. The evening started tense. But then Sophie approached Beatrice with a drawing she'd made for Grandma, and something cracked in the woman's armor. She looked at the crooked drawing of a family, with Grandma written in childish letters, and her eyes filled with tears. Sarah, seeing the moment, did something brave. She sat next to Beatrice and talked, not with anger or resentment, but with honesty. She said she understood being a surprise, a shock. She wasn't the daughter-in-law Beatrice had imagined, but she loved Michael, loved her children, and wanted to build bridges, not walls. Beatrice looked at her for a long time, then, with a broken voice, admitted she'd been afraid. Afraid Sarah was after money, afraid of scandal, afraid of losing her son. But watching Michael with Sarah and the children, she saw something she'd never seen: genuine happiness. It wasn't an immediate movie reconciliation, but it was a start. Beatrice started visiting the grandchildren, then visits became lunches, then weekly dinners. Slowly, the Carter family began accepting Sarah not as the former housekeeper, but as Mrs. Carter. 3 years after the wedding, Michael and Sarah stood on their penthouse balcony, watching illuminated New York. Inside, Luke and Sophie slept, now 5-and-a-half-year-old children, full of life and laughter. Much had changed. Sarah had become a respected philanthropist, using her experience to create foundations helping single mothers. Michael had expanded the company, but now with focus on ethical and sustainable investments. Sarah's influence. The Carter family had completely reconciled. Beatrice adored her grandchildren and had developed a reluctant but genuine respect for Sarah. William, the father, had returned from Palm Beach just to spend time with the twins. But the most surprising thing was what had happened between Michael and Sarah themselves. What had started as a marriage of convenience for the children had become something real. They'd fallen in love, slowly, day by day, discovering they were perfect for each other. Michael still remembered the moment he'd realized he loved her. It had been a normal evening, Sarah cooking while he helped the children with homework. She'd laughed at something Luke said, and Michael had looked at that scene, his wife, his children, the life they'd built, and felt absolute certainty. This was happiness. Sarah had confessed her similar moment. It had been when Michael gave up an important business trip to Tokyo because Sophie had the flu and only wanted her daddy. Seeing this powerful man choose to stay home, read bedtime stories with funny voices while holding their sick daughter, Sarah had understood she loved him. Now, on the balcony, Michael took Sarah's hand. He told her something he'd wanted to say for a while. He asked her to marry him again. Not at City Hall with 2 witnesses, but with a real ceremony, with friends and family. celebrating not a practical arrangement, but true love. Sarah laughed through tears. She said yes, of course yes. The ceremony was held 6 months later, at the penthouse where everything had started. It was a perfect circle. The terrace where Sarah had worked as a housekeeper was now decorated with white flowers and soft lights. Guests included not only the New York elite, but also Sarah's friends from her working-class neighborhood, women she'd helped with her foundation. Luke and Sophie were ring-bearer and flower girl, proud and adorable in their formal clothes. Beatrice cried openly when Michael and Sarah exchanged vows. This time vows they'd written themselves, full of love, gratitude, promises. When Michael kissed the bride, it was different from the hurried City Hall kiss. This was a kiss celebrating everything they'd overcome, everything they'd built. At the reception, Sarah danced with Michael under the stars. He whispered how grateful he was for that night 3.5 years ago, for the courage she'd had raising the children alone, for accepting his crazy proposal. Sarah replied it had been the best decision of her life. She'd started as a housekeeper in his home, fled scared and alone, returned by chance, married the man she loved. And now she was Mrs. Carter, not for the name or money, but because she'd chosen love. Later that night, after guests had left and the children slept in their rooms, Michael and Sarah stood in the penthouse bedroom, the same room where everything had begun that fateful night. Michael said they owed something to those past versions of themselves, two lonely people who'd found comfort in each other for one night, not knowing they were creating not just two beautiful children, but also a future together. Sarah agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. She said sometimes the best things in life come from mistakes. That night they'd thought they'd made a mistake, but actually, they'd started their love story. It just took 3 years to realize it. And as New York slept below them, the millionaire and the former housekeeper who'd defied every expectation fell asleep in each other's arms, knowing their twins, Luke and Sophie, the secret that changed everything, were living proof that love can be born in the most unexpected ways and triumph over every obstacle. Like if you believe true love overcomes class differences. Comment if you've ever had to make a difficult choice to protect those you love. Share this story of secrets, second chances, and unexpected love. Subscribe for more stories proving families are built with hearts, not conventions. Sometimes the biggest secrets lead to the most unexpected blessings. And sometimes it takes the courage of 2 children with the same green eyes to make 2 adults understand they were meant to be a family from the beginning.